Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Stories. Tonight, we are going to look at the uncomfortable reality behind the Viking legend. When most people think of the Norsemen, they picture a gym rat with an axe screaming about Valhalla while jumping off a longship. But the reality is that for 99% of their lives, these guys were just freezing cold farmers, trying to figure out how to live inside a pile of dirt without dying of pneumonia. It is less like an epic fantasy movie and more like a survival reality show, where the only building material you have is mud and desperation. We are going to dig deep into the engineering and the smells and the absolute claustrophobia of surviving a Nordic winter in a hole in the ground. All right, time to get comfortable. Dim the lights. Turn on a fan or heater for that soft white noise. Cuddle up with your dog or cat in your warm bed. And let's begin tonight's journey to make you fall asleep fast. To understand why anyone would choose to live inside a wall of turf, you first have to understand the hostile real estate market of the North Atlantic in the 9th century. Imagine you have just decided to pack up your entire life in Norway because you're tired of paying taxes to a king who has too many rules. You load your family and your cattle and your slaves onto a wooden boat that is essentially an open canoe, and you sail west until you hit ice. You step off the boat, and the first thing that hits you is the wind. It is not a breeze. It is a solid wall of moving air that wants to push you back into the ocean. The air is so clean and sharp that it hurts your lungs. You look around at this new land that you've claimed and you realize that you have made a terrible mistake. It is stunningly beautiful, with glaciers and volcanoes and waterfalls, but it is also completely indifferent to your survival. It is the medieval equivalent of buying a fixer-upper house without getting an inspection first, and then realizing the house is actually just a barren rock in the middle of a freezing ocean. The biggest problem facing these early settlers was a lack of timber. When they first arrived, the sagas tell us that the island was forested from the mountains to the sea. But that is a bit of a generous description. The trees in Iceland are primarily downy birch. They are not the majestic oaks or towering pines you would find on the continent. They are scraggly, twisted little trees that look like they are already suffering from hypothermia. They rarely grow straight, and they aren't very tall. They are more like large bushes that are trying their best. Within a few decades, the settlers had cut down almost all of these trees to burn for fuel and to make charcoal for smelting iron. It was an ecological disaster that happened almost overnight. They destroyed the forest cover, which led to massive soil erosion. So now you are standing on a wind-swept island just below the Arctic Circle, and you have no wood to build a house. You cannot order lumber from Amazon, and the nearest forest is 1,000 miles of ocean away. Even if you had the wood, a traditional wooden house would be a death trap here. The climate in Iceland and Greenland is wet and windy. It rains horizontally. The wind screams across the landscape with nothing to stop it. If you built a standard tall wooden house with vertical walls, the wind would hammer against it constantly. It would find every crack and every knot in the wood. The draft would be constant. You would be burning fuel 24 hours a day just to keep the temperature above freezing. A wooden house in this environment acts like a drum. The wind beats on it and the noise inside would be deafening. You would never sleep. So the settlers had to look down. They looked at the ground beneath their boots. The soil in Iceland is volcanic and rich, and because of the constant dampness, it supports a very thick layer of grass. The root systems are dense and tangled. It is like a heavy carpet that covers the lava rock. They realized that the earth itself was the only building material they had in unlimited supply. This wasn't a new idea. Humans have been building with earth for thousands of years. But the Vikings took it to an engineering extreme because they had no other choice. They realized that if you cut the earth into blocks, you could stack it like bricks. But more importantly, they understood the thermal properties of dirt. Dirt is an incredible insulator. It has high thermal mass. That means it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. In the summer, the thick dirt walls would keep the interior cool. In the winter, they would hold onto the heat generated by the fire and the bodies inside. Living inside a turf house is like living inside a giant duvet. It creates a stable internal temperature regardless of what the blizzard is doing outside. But shifting your mindset to live underground or semi-heather ground requires a change in psychology. You are essentially deciding to live in a burrow. You are trading light and air and views for warmth. You are giving up the status symbol of a high timber hall for the survival of a mud hut. The landscape dictates everything. You walk inland away from the coast looking for a spot to build. You can't just pick the spot with the best view. That is a rookie mistake. If you build on top of a hill to see your enemies coming, the wind will rip your roof off in the first winter storm. You need to find a spot that is sheltered. You look for the lee side of a hill or a small valley where the earth rises up to protect you. You are walking through the wet grass and your leather boots are soaked through. The ground is spongy. It squelches under your weight. This is the constant reality of the North. Everything is wet. The air is wet. The ground is wet. Your clothes are wet. The battle you are fighting is not against wild animals or rival clans. It is a battle against moisture. Damp is the silent killer. If you get wet and you can't get dry, you die. It is that simple. So, as you survey the land, you are looking for drainage. You need a slope. If you build on flat ground, the water will pool and your floor will turn into a swamp. You need the gravity to work for you. You need the water to flow away from your bed. You find a gentle slope facing south to catch the few hours of weak sunlight that you get in the winter. The sun in the winter here is barely a presence. It skims the horizon like a lazy coin rolling across a table, gives off no heat. It just casts long, depressing shadows that seem to stretch on forever. You stand there on the slope and you mark out the footprint of your new home. It won't be a square. It will be a long rectangle or a series of connected rooms. You take out your spade, which is likely made of wood with a small iron cutting edge, because iron is too precious to waste on a full shovel head. You strike the ground. The sound is a dull thud. You are about to move tons of earth by hand. There are no excavators. There are no wheelbarrows even. Just you and a shovel and a cloak that you can use as a sling to carry the dirt. You start to dig into the slope. You are cutting into the skin of the earth. The smell of the soil is pungent and rich. It smells of decaying roots and volcanic ash. It is a dark, peaty smell that will become the background scent of your entire life. You are not just building a house. You are digging a grave for your old life and building a womb for your new one. You strike the ground again and again, and the realization sets in that this is going to be the hardest physical labor of your entire life. You are not just digging a hole, you are engaging in terraforming on a micro scale. The survival of your family depends entirely on how well you understand the movement of water through soil. If you get this wrong, your floor will turn into a stagnant pond within a week, and the structural integrity of your walls will fail. This is high-stakes engineering, performed by people who technically still believe that thunder is caused by a guy riding a chariot in the sky. Before we continue tonight's journey, if you enjoy our sleep stories, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support truly helps this new channel grow. I'm always curious where everyone is listening from, so please drop a comment sharing your location and what time it is there right now. I love reading them and seeing our global community connect through these stories. Now, let's ease back into the narrative. The choice of the slope is critical because you are trying to cheat the wind. By digging into the side of a hill, you are letting the landscape do half the work for you. The hill itself becomes your back wall. It is solid and thick and infinite. The wind can scream over the top of the hill and miss your roof entirely. You are tucking yourself into the armpit of the landscape for protection, but the digging is brutal. The soil in Iceland is often shallow and sits on top of jagged lava fields. You might get through 2 feet of soft peat and then hit a layer of basalt that has been there since the last volcanic eruption. You cannot dig through basalt with a wooden spade, so you have to scrape around it. You have to leverage massive rocks out of the earth using timber poles as fulcrums. It is a wrestling match with geology. You are moving cubic tons of earth. Think about the weight of a single bag of potting soil from the garden center. Now imagine moving thousands of those bags. But you don't have a wheelbarrow. You have a cloak made of coarse wool, or maybe a sled made of driftwood if you are lucky. You shovel the dirt onto the cloak and then you drag it away. Your hands are calloused and cracked from the cold. The dirt works its way under your fingernails and into the creases of your palms, and it stays there. You become part of the earth before the house is even built. The hydrology is the tricky part. You have to understand how water moves through the hill. If you cut into the slope, you are essentially creating a wound in the earth that will bleed water. When it rains on the hill above you, that water sinks into the ground and travels downhill through the soil. If you dig a hole in the path of that water, your house becomes a drain. You will wake up floating. So, you have to be smart. You have to dig drainage ditches around the perimeter of your site. These are trenches that intercept the groundwater coming down the hill and divert it around your future home. It is exactly the same principle used in modern civil engineering for highway construction, but you are doing it by eye. You watch where the water flows during a rainstorm and you try to negotiate with it. You can't stop the water. You can only politely suggest it goes somewhere else. The ground you are exposing will become your floor. There is no pouring of concrete slabs here. There is no hardwood flooring or plush carpet. The floor is just the subsoil packed down hard. You spend days walking over it and pounding it with heavy wooden beetles, which are like giant mallets. You want it to be as hard as stone. Over time, the grease from cooking and the ash from the fire and the spilled ale will mix with the dirt to create a weirdly smooth, almost polished surface. But right now, it is just cold, damp clay. Read. You have to level it perfectly. If there is a dip in the floor, water will collect there. If there is a bump, you will stub your toe on it every single day for the rest of your life. In the dim light of winter, you are on your hands and knees using a straight piece of wood to check the level. You are shivering. The sweat on your back cools instantly when you stop moving. It is a dangerous kind of cold. the kind that seeps into your bones and makes your joints ache. You are also fighting the permafrost in some northern areas, or at least the deep frost that sets in during the winter. The ground freezes solid. If you are building in the autumn, you are racing against the clock. Once the ground freezes, it is like trying to chip away at concrete. You have to get the digging done while the earth is still pliable. If you miss your window, you are sleeping in a tent made of skins for the winter, and you probably won't wake up in the spring. The site preparation also involves stripping the turf from the surface. You don't just hack it away and throw it out. The turf is your bricks. It is your insulation. It is the most valuable material you have. You have to remove it gently. You treat it like you are performing surgery. You cut the surface grass into distinct shapes, which we will talk about later. But for now, you are stacking them carefully to the side. You keep them moist. If they dry out and the grass dies, the root structure crumbles and your building blocks turn to dust. So the construction site looks like a muddy scar on the green hillside. Piles of rocks are stacked on one side, piles of turf are stacked on the other, and in the middle is a flat, muddy platform carved into the slope. It looks small. It looks insignificant against the vast grey sky and the towering mountains in the distance. It feels impossible that this shallow depression in the ground is going to protect you from the Arctic fury that is coming. You stand in the center of your leveled floor and you look up at the sky. The clouds are moving fast. The wind is picking up. You can smell the snow in the air. It smells like ozone and iron. The urgency hits you. You have leveled the site. You have solved the drainage, but you still have no walls and no roof. You are standing in a mud puddle at the end of the world, and winter is coming to kill you. You need a foundation. You cannot just pile the dirt walls onto the dirt floor. The damp would rise up through capillary action and rot the walls from the bottom up. You need a break. You need a barrier between the wet earth and your home. You need stones, thousands of them, and you have to find them and carry them here one by one. The back-breaking labor has only just begun. You head down to the nearest stream or riverbed, which, in this landscape, is never very far away. You are looking for rocks, but not just any rocks. You need specific shapes. You need flat stones that can stack without rolling away. You need heavy stones for the base and slightly lighter ones for the upper layers. You are essentially playing a high-stakes game of Tetris, where the pieces weigh 50 pounds each, and if you lose, your house collapses on your children. The river water is glacial melt. It is freezing. You have to wade in to pry the good stones loose from the mud. Your hands go numb within seconds. You lose the ability to feel the rough texture of the basalt against your skin. You are just operating claws at the end of your arms, hooking them under a rock and heaving it up onto the bank. It is a grueling, repetitive misery. It is the original CrossFit workout, except the only protein shake waiting for you is a bowl of watery porridge and the grim satisfaction of not freezing to death. You haul these stones back to the building site one by one, or on a wooden sledge if the ground isn't too boggy. You create a pile that looks like a cairn, a burial mound. In a way, it is. You are burying your labor. You are investing calories, which are a very scarce currency, into this pile of rocks. Every trip back and forth burns energy that you have to replenish with food that you barely have. The economics of survival are brutal. You are constantly calculating if the effort is worth the calorie cost. Now you start to lay the perimeter. This is where the engineering kicks in. You are not building the whole wall out of stone. You don't have enough rocks, and even if you did, a stone wall is terrible at keeping heat in. Stone is a thermal bridge. It sucks heat out of a room and radiates it into the cold night air. If you lived in an all-stone castle in Iceland, you would be a popsicle by morning. No, the stones are just the footer. They are the damp-proof course. In modern construction, we use a strip of plastic or bitumen to stop moisture from rising up from the ground into the brickwork. The Vikings didn't have plastic. They used gravity and geology. If you placed the turf blocks directly onto the soil, the moisture from the wet ground will wick up into the walls. It is called capillary action. The turf acts like a giant sponge. It will drink the groundwater until the bottom layer of your wall turns into a slurry of mud. Once the bottom layer rots, the 10 tons of wall above it will come crashing down. The stones sever this connection. They create a dry break. Moisture cannot climb up a non-porous rock the way it climbs up a root system. You kneel in the mud and start placing the base layer. You are looking for the biggest, ugliest rocks you can find. These are the anchors. You dig them slightly into the subsoil to seat them. Then you start stacking. There is no mortar. There is no cement. You don't have lime to make a mix. This is dry stone walling. It relies entirely on friction and the interlocking weight of the stones. You pick up a rock, turn it over in your hands, eyeing its geometry. You try to fit it into a gap. It wobbles. You curse, take it out, rotate it 30 degrees and try again. Click. It locks into place. That sound, the dry clack of stone against stone, is the only sound on the construction site other than your own heavy breathing and the wind. You have to build 2 rows of stones, an inner face and an outer face. The wall is going to be incredibly thick, maybe 6 feet wide at the base. You are outlining a massive footprint. The space between the inner stone row and the outer stone row will eventually be filled with compressed earth and gravel. But for now, you are just laying the skeletal tracks. You have to be a perfectionist here. If a stone wiggles now, it will move later, and when it moves later, it will have a roof sitting on it. You use small shards of rock, little slivers called shims, to wedge into the gaps and stop the big rocks from rocking. You are jamming these little wedges in with your thumb, hoping you don't smash your finger when the big rock settles. The height of this stone base varies. Sometimes it's just a foot or 2 high. Sometimes, if you are wealthy and have a lot of slaves to carry rocks, you build it up to chest height to save on turf. But usually it's low. It's just enough to get the turf off the wet ground. As you work, you are constantly checking the batter, that is, the inward slope of the wall. You never build a dry stone wall perfectly vertical. Gravity will push it out and it will topple. You build it leaning slightly inward, so the building is hugging itself. It pushes in against its own weight. It makes the structure stable. It looks prehistoric. This ring of rough grey stones rising out of the green hillside. It looks like a ruin before it has even been built. Your back is screaming. You are bent double for hours at a time. The cold wind whips around your kidneys. You stop to straighten up and your spine cracks audibly. You look at your hands. They are raw. The basalt is sharp. It is basically frozen lava. It cuts your skin like glass. You wrap your hands in rags, but the rags get wet and freeze stiff, making it even harder to grip the smooth river stones. But slowly the outline of the house appears. You can see where the door will be. You leave a gap in the stone circle. You can see the main hall. You can see the pantry. It is a blueprint drawn in heavy grey lines on the landscape. You finish the stone layer and stand back. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a sheep pen. But this is the most important part of the house. Without this, the rot sets in. The rot is the enemy. In this climate, nature is constantly trying to break everything down into compost. Wood rots, leather rots, wool rots, food rots. Your job is to build a fortress that delays the rot for as long as possible. The stones are cold and hard and indifferent. They will outlast you. They will outlast your children. 1,000 years from now, when the turf has long since turned back into dirt and the wooden beams have decayed into nothing, archaeologists will come here. They will peel back the layer of soil and they will find these stones. They will see the outline of your struggle. They will see where you placed the hearth and where you placed the door. They will marvel at how you managed to fit these irregular shapes together so perfectly that they haven't moved in a millennium. But right now, you don't care about your legacy. You care about the fact that it is starting to sleet, and you still have a massive amount of dirt to cut. You have the foundation, now you need the insulation. You need the turf, and not just any turf. You need to become a connoisseur of grass roots. You need to head out into the bog with a specialized knife and start harvesting the skin of the earth. You walk out to the marshland where the ground is boggy and the grass grows thick and wild. This isn't the polite green lawn of a suburban house. This is a tangle of ancient root systems that have been fighting for space since the Ice Age. To the untrained eye, it looks like a field. To a Viking builder, it looks like a hardware store. Not all dirt is created equal. If you dig up the sandy soil near the coast, it will crumble in your hands like dry cake. You can't build with that. You need the miri. That is the Icelandic word for a swampy marshland. The grass here grows deep roots to anchor itself in the wet soil. These roots are the rebar of the natural world. They bind the earth together into a solid mat that is incredibly tough to tear apart. You are looking for a root density that is basically a solid block of vegetable fiber with some dirt trapped inside it. You bring your tool. It is called a torfliar. It looks like a scythe that has been flattened out and given a long, straight handle. It is an awkward-looking instrument that resembles a giant cheese slicer. Using it requires a very specific motion. You kick it into the ground with your foot and then slice forward. It makes a distinct sound. A tearing, ripping noise, like heavy canvas being torn in half. Shrip, shrip, shrip. It is the sound of the landscape being peeled. You are not just cutting squares. Anyone can cut a square. You are cutting clambra. This is a specific architectural shape that the Norse perfected over centuries of trial and error. A clambra isn't a brick. It is a wedge. Imagine cutting a long strip of turf, maybe 3 feet long and a foot wide. But you cut it at an angle so the sides slant inwards. When you pull it out of the ground, it looks like a trapezoid. But here is the magic trick. You slice down the middle of the thickest part, almost all the way through, but you leave the grass on top intact, acting as a hinge. When you pick it up, you unfold it like a book. Now you have a double wedge shape. two triangles connected by a strip of grass. Why do you do this? Because you aren't just stacking these blocks, you are going to weave them. When you lay a clamber on a wall, the two wings splay out and lock into the blocks next to them. It creates a herringbone pattern. It is incredibly stable. A straight stack of bricks can topple over if the ground shifts. A woven wall of clamber moves and flexes like a basket. It can ride out an earthquake or the settling of the frost-heaved ground without cracking. But before you can build, you have to harvest thousands of these things. The sheer weight of it is hard to comprehend. A single wet clamber block can weigh as much as a small child. It is sodden with water. It is dense. You lift it out of the sucking mud with a groan. Your lower back takes the strain. You stack it on a wooden sled. Or if you are rich, you load it onto the back of an Icelandic horse. These horses are small, but they are tanks. They have a low center of gravity and a thick winter coat, and they look at you with a mixture of boredom and contempt as you load them up with dirt. They trudge back and forth from the bog to the building site, their hooves sinking into the muck. If you don't have a horse, you are the horse. You carry the turf on your back using a wooden frame. The water from the turf seeps through your clothes. You are wet within 10 minutes and you stay wet for the next 10 hours. You also need different cuts for different parts of the house. The clamber is for the core of the wall, but you also need strengur. These are long, thin strips of turf, almost like ropes. You use these to tie the layers together, and you need snidda, which are diamond-shaped blocks for the intricate corners. You are essentially manufacturing a complex kit of parts out of mud. You have to be careful with the depth of the cut. If you cut too deep, you get too much soil and not enough root, and the block will fall apart. If you cut too shallow, the block will be too light and will dry out and blow away. You need the Goldilocks zone, about 4 inches of solid root-bound earth. As you cut, you expose the soil to the air for the first time in centuries. The smell is intense. It is the smell of decomposition and life mixed together. It creates a peculiar sensory environment. You are surrounded by the raw scent of the earth. It gets into your nose and your mouth. You taste the iron and the peat. Once you have harvested the turf, you can't just slap it on the wall immediately. Ideally, you let it dry out a little bit. You want it to be tacky, not dripping wet. If it is too wet, it will shrink massively as it dries, and your wall will end up full of gaps where the wind can whistle through. If it is too dry, the roots die and the block crumbles. You have to manage the moisture content of your building materials by looking at the sky and guessing the humidity. You arrange the blocks in piles near the stone foundation. You organize them by type. The clambra here, the strengur there. It looks like a chaotic garden center. You are looking at a pile of grass and dirt that is roughly the volume of a modern swimming pool, and you have to move every single ounce of it by hand into a specific geometric pattern. The sun starts to dip low. The temperature drops. The mud on your hands starts to crust over and stiffen as it freezes. You look at the pile. It doesn't look like a house. It looks like a landscaping project gone wrong. But to a Viking, this pile represents safety. This is the barrier between life and death. You pick up the first clambra block. You shake off the loose dirt. You walk over to the stone foundation you built yesterday. You are about to start the snidda technique. You are about to become a weaver of earth. You place the first block on the stones. It lands with a heavy, wet thud. It is satisfying. It is the first note in a long symphony of construction that will result in a home. You place that first turf block onto the stone foundation, and you realize immediately that this is not like building with Lego bricks. A brick is rigid and predictable. Turf is alive and compressible. When you push down on it, the block squishes and changes shape. You're building with a material that fights back. This is where the snidda technique comes into play. If you just stacked the turf blocks directly on top of each other like a modern brick wall, the vertical seams would line up. As the turf dried and shrank, long cracks would open up from the roof to the ground. The wind would blow right through your house, and the structural integrity would be zero. You would be living in a house of cards made of dirt, so you weave the wall. You take your diamond-shaped snidda blocks and you lay them at an angle. The next layer goes at the opposite angle. You are creating a herringbone pattern. It looks exactly like the tweed fabric of a jacket, but magnified to the scale of a building. The grass side of the turf always faces outwards. This is crucial. The roots need to stay oriented correctly to hold the soil together. You want the wall to look like a grassy hill that has been sliced open. You are not building a single wall. You are building a sandwich. You build an outer skin of turf and an inner skin of turf. Between them you leave a gap, maybe 2 or 3 feet wide. You fill this gap with loose earth and gravel. You stomp it down until it is rock hard. This core is the thermal battery of the house. This construction method results in walls that are incredibly thick. We are talking 6 to 10 feet thick at the base. In modern architectural terms, this is insane. You are losing a huge amount of square footage to the walls themselves. If you tried to pull a permit for this in a modern city, the zoning board would laugh you out of the room. But in the Viking Age, square footage is irrelevant. Heat retention is the only metric that matters. Think of it like a Yeti cooler. You know how those expensive coolers have really thick plastic walls filled with foam insulation? A turf house is a Yeti cooler made of mud. The thickness creates thermal lag. When the sun hits the outside of the wall in the morning, the heat starts to travel through the dirt. Because the wall is so thick, it takes hours for that heat to reach the inside. By the time the heat reaches the living space, it is nighttime when the outside air is freezing. The wall releases the stored warmth into the room, just when you need it. Conversely, when the fire inside heats up the inner wall, the heat travels slowly outwards. It gets trapped in the core. The wall acts as a regulator. It flattens out the spikes and dips in temperature. Outside, it might swing from freezing to slightly less freezing, but inside, the temperature stays relatively constant. It is passive climate control, invented by people who couldn't read. As you build higher, you have to constantly check the angle. The walls have to taper inwards as they go up. If they go straight up, they will buckle under their own weight. The turf is heavy. A wet wall can weigh tons. By leaning it in, you are directing the force of gravity down through the center of the wall into the stone foundation. It is a pyramid structure disguised as a cottage. The work is quiet. There is no hammering. There is just the soft thump-thump of the turf blocks landing and the shuffling sound of your boots. The wall grows slowly. It rises around you like a tide. As it gets higher, the wind inside the perimeter dies down. You suddenly find yourself standing in a pocket of still air. The noise of the ocean and the wind is muffled. The turf absorbs sound. It is an acoustic damper. Standing inside a half-built turf house, feels like wearing noise-cancelling headphones, but the walls are alive. This is the weird part. The grass on the outside of the blocks doesn't necessarily die. If you harvest it carefully and the season is right, the grass will keep growing. The roots will grow into the blocks above and below, knitting the wall together into a single biological organism. Your house is technically a plant. This means you have to maintain it like a garden. In the summer, the walls will turn green and lush. You might even get wildflowers growing out of your living room wall. In the winter, the grass turns brown and dormant. You are living inside a vertical meadow. You reach chest height and the labor gets harder. You have to lift the heavy blocks up to place them. You are covered in mud. It is in your hair. It is in your ears. You look like a golem made of clay, but you can feel the protection forming around you. The world outside is grey and hostile, but inside these thick earthen ramparts there is the promise of safety. You leave spaces for the windows, but calling them windows is a stretch. They are tiny holes, maybe 6 inches square. You don't want big windows. Glass is rare and expensive, and mostly unknown in common houses. A big window is just a hole that lets the heat out. You cover these tiny openings with the translucent membrane from a sheep's stomach. It lets in a milky, diffuse light, but you can't see through it. It is like living inside a cataract. Finally, the walls reach their full height. They are massive, sloping berms of earth. From the outside, the house looks like it is melting back into the landscape. It is excellent camouflage. Unless you are standing right in front of the door, you might not even see the house against the hillside. This is useful in an era where your neighbors might decide to raid you because they are bored. But now you have a problem. You have 4 solid walls enclosing a space. You have a dirt floor, but you are standing in an open box. It starts to rain and the floor turns to mud again. You need a roof. And to build a roof, you need long, straight beams to span the gap between the walls. You look around. There are still no trees. You look at the scrubby birch bushes and shake your head. You cannot build a roof out of shrubs. You need timber. Heavy structural timber. And the only place to get it is from the ocean. You have to go beachcombing for the wreckage of Siberian forests that have drifted across the polar ice cap. You are about to enter the highly litigious and desperate world of driftwood rights. You stand inside your completed turf walls and look up. You have built a magnificent fortress of dirt. It dampens the sound and blocks the wind. But right now, it is just a very expensive swimming pool waiting for the next rainstorm. You need a roof. In any other part of medieval Europe, you would simply walk into the forest and chop down a few oaks. But here in the North Atlantic, you might as well be looking for gold bullion growing on a bush. There are no trees big enough to span the width of your house. The native birch is twisted and weak. If you try to build a roof beam out of it, the roof will collapse the first time it snows, and you will be crushed to death in your sleep. This is the timber crisis. It was the defining economic struggle of the Viking Age in Iceland. So where do you get the wood? You look to the ocean. You become a scavenger. You rely on a global conveyor belt of currents that starts thousands of miles away in Siberia. Huge trees fall into the rivers of Russia. They float out into the Arctic Ocean. They get frozen into the pack ice. They drift across the top of the world for years. Eventually they break free, and the currents carry them south to wash up on the beaches of Iceland and Greenland. This is driftwood, but calling it driftwood makes it sound like a cute decoration you put on a bathroom shelf. To a Viking, this is reki, It is the most valuable commodity on the island. Finding a large straight log of Siberian larch on the beach was the medieval equivalent of finding a duffel bag full of cash on the sidewalk. It was a life-altering event. If you found a good log, you didn't just high-five your buddy, you thanked the gods. You claimed it immediately. Because this wood was so valuable, the Vikings developed an incredibly complex legal system around it. You couldn't just walk along the beach and pick up wood. The rights to the driftwood belonged to the person who owned the land where it washed up. If you owned a stretch of coastline known for catching drift, you were essentially a millionaire. You were a timber baron who didn't have to plant a single tree. If you were a tenant farmer, you had to buy the wood from the landowner. If you tried to steal a log under the cover of darkness, you were committing a serious crime. The sagas are full of stories of men killing each other over a piece of wet wood. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades would start blood feuds because a particularly nice pine log washed up on the border of their property. Let's say you have secured your timber. You have traded 3 cows and a heap of silver for a pile of grey, salty logs. Now you have to work it. This is not like working with fresh lumber. This wood has been soaking in salt water for years. It is impregnated with brine. On the positive side, the salt acts as a preservative. It kills fungi and bugs. A driftwood beam will last twice as long as a fresh timber beam because it is essentially pickled. But on the negative side, it is brutal on your tools. The salt crystals in the wood dull your iron axe blades instantly. You spend half your day sharpening your tools. The wood is hard and brittle. It doesn't slice cleanly, it splinters. You drag these heavy grey bones of trees back to your site. You strip off the bleached outer layer to reveal the reddish wood underneath. It smells of the ocean. Even years later, when you are lying in bed looking up at your roof beams, you will smell the faint scent of salt and iodine. Your house smells like a shipwreck. Now you have to frame the roof. Because wood is so scarce, you can't use the truss system that we use today. You know the triangle shape inside a modern attic? That uses too much wood. Instead, you use a post and beam system. You dig holes in your dirt floor and set upright posts, called staff, into the ground. These posts hold up the main roof beam or the ridge pole. You are building a forest of columns inside your living room. The interior of a turf house feels like a crypt or a forest because of these pillars. They divide the space. You don't have a wide open floor plan. You have a space interrupted by heavy grey timber. You place the rafters across the ridge pole. You don't nail them. Iron nails are way too expensive to waste on framing. You use wooden pegs, or you tie them together. Sometimes you use the roots of the birch trees as rope. You lash the timber together like you are building a raft. The geometry is crucial. The roof needs to be steep enough to shed rain, but not so steep that the wind catches it like a sail. The pitch is usually around 45 degrees. It is an aerodynamic shape. The wind hits the turf wall, flows up the slope, and goes right over the roof. The house is designed to be slippery to the wind. But you don't just put planks on the rafters. You don't have enough wood for planks. You can't afford to cover the whole roof in boards. So you use brushwood. You go out and cut tons of the scraggly birch bushes and willow scrub. You weave this into a mat that sits on top of the rafters. Looking up from the inside, you see a skeleton of grey driftwood holding up a messy tangle of twigs. It looks precarious. It looks like a bird's nest. But this brushwood layer is just the support. It is the lath. It is there to hold the waterproofing layer, which we will get to in the next part. There is a psychological weight to this timber. Every time you look at a beam, you know exactly what it cost you. You know that the pillar standing by your bed traveled across the Arctic Ocean to get here. You treat the wood with reverence. You carve protective symbols into it. You might carve the face of a god or a spirit into the top of the post to watch over the house. This scarcity creates a culture of recycling that would put modern environmentalists to shame. When a house eventually collapsed or was abandoned, they didn't leave the wood. They pulled the timber out of the ruins and reused it. A single beam might serve in 5 different houses over 300 years. It would be passed down from father to son. This is the beam that my grandfather found on the beach in the year of the great storm, you would say. It was an heirloom. You finish the framing, you stand back and wipe the sweat from your eyes. You have the skeleton of the roof. It casts a striped shadow on the dirt floor, but it is still open to the sky. If it rains now, you will just have wet sticks and a muddy floor. You need to seal it. You need to make it waterproof. And for that you need nature's Gore-Tex. You need birch bark. And you need a lot of it. You are about to strip every tree within a 10-mile radius naked to keep your family dry. You have the bones of the roof in place. The driftwood rafters are lashed together and covered with a mat of woven brushwood twigs. If you stopped now, you would have a very nice pergola for a summer garden party. But this is the North Atlantic, and winter is coming with the subtlety of a freight train. You need to make this thing watertight. This is where the engineering gets surprisingly high-tech. Using very low-tech materials, the Vikings understood the concept of layering. You don't just rely on one material to do everything. You build a system. The first layer on top of the brushwood is birch bark. In the short summer, the locals would head out to the scrubby forests and peel the bark off the trees in large sheets. Birch bark is miraculous stuff. It is filled with natural oils and resins that make it waterproof and road-resistant. You can find birch bark buried in the mud for 1,000 years and it is still intact. It is nature's plastic. You lay the bark sheets over the brushwood like shingles. You overlap them carefully, just like modern roofing tiles. You start at the bottom and work your way up, so the water runs off one sheet onto the next. This is your waterproof membrane. If you do this right, not a single drop of rain will penetrate into the living space. But birch bark is light. It curls up when it dries. If a gust of wind hits it, it will blow away into the Atlantic. You need to weigh it down. You need ballast. And you need insulation. So we go back to the turf. You remember the stranger cuts, the long, thin strips of turf? You lay those over the birch bark. You place them grass side down. This is important. You want the soil to be pressed against the bark. The weight of the earth holds the bark flat and seals the overlaps. Then you add another layer of turf on top of that. This time you place it grass side up. You are sandwiching the bark between 2 layers of earth. The top layer of grass is alive. When the spring comes, it will grow. The roots will push down into the lower layer of turf, knitting the whole roof into a single solid mat. You are essentially putting a hat made of lawn onto your house. This living roof is brilliant. In the summer, the grass grows tall. It transpires moisture, cooling the house through evaporation. In the winter, the grass dies back and creates a layer of dry organic matter that traps air and insulates the roof. And when it snows, the snow sits on top of the grass and adds yet another layer of insulation. Snow is actually a great insulator because it is mostly trapped air. So the worse the weather gets, the warmer your house becomes. But the weight is immense. We're talking about tons of wet earth sitting over your head. This is why those driftwood beams had to be so thick. You are constantly listening to your house. You listen for the creak of timber under strain. If you hear a loud crack in the middle of the night, it is terrifying. It means the roof might be about to pancake you. The aerodynamics of this roof are perfect. Because the walls slope in and the roof slopes up, the wind sees the house as a hill. It flows over it smoothly. There are no sharp corners for the wind to grab onto, no eaves to lift up. A modern house with an overhanging roof would be ripped apart in an Icelandic gale. A turf house just hunkers down and lets the storm pass over. However, there is a downside to a grass roof. It is an ecosystem. Insects love it. Beetles, worms, and spiders live in your roof. And gravity being what it is, they sometimes fall out. You are eating your dinner, and a worm drops onto your plate. You are sleeping, and a spider descends onto your face. This is just a fact of life. You don't call an exterminator. You just flick it off and go back to sleep. Animals love the roof too. Goats and sheep will climb up onto your house to graze. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves thumping directly above your head. Clop, clop, clop. It sounds like someone is walking around in the attic, but it is just a goat eating your shingles. The maintenance is constant. The grass needs to be healthy. If the grass dies, yes, you want your roof to be fertilized. It is a weird concept. You are living inside a piece of agriculture. But eventually you finish. You stand back and look at it. The house is done. It looks like a mound of earth with a door in it. It looks like a hobbit hole, but without the whimsy. It is dark and brooding. The only colour comes from the green grass and the grey stones. Now you have to seal the entrance. The door is the weak point. It is the only hole in your thermal armour. You cannot have a big, welcoming double door. You need a small, defensible opening that keeps the heat in. You build the door frame out of the best timber you have. You make it low. You want people to have to duck to get in. This forces a posture of humility. But more importantly, it keeps the warm air, which rises, from escaping every time you open the door. The door itself is made of heavy planks pinned together with wooden dowels. You might cover it with a sealskin or a heavy wool tapestry on the inside to stop drafts. You don't have a doorknob. You have a wooden latch or a simple bar. When you step through that door, you are crossing a threshold in the literal and metaphorical sense. You are leaving the vast, freezing indifference of the natural world and entering the human sphere. But the transition isn't immediate. You don't step straight into the living room. That would be a thermal disaster. You step into the andiri, the cold porch. This is the airlock. It is a small, unheated room with a dirt floor. It is where you stomp the snow off your boots. It is where you leave your wet cloak. It smells of damp wool and mud. The purpose of this room is to buffer the temperature. If you opened a door directly from the outside, 10 degrees, to the inside, 50 degrees, the rush of cold air would be intense. The cold porch allows you to close the outer door before you open the inner door. It traps a pocket of air that is halfway between the two temperatures. Standing in the cold porch, you are in limbo. It is dark. Maybe a single sliver of light comes through a crack. You can hear the wind howling outside, but it sounds muffled now. Ahead of you is another door leading into the main hall. You can smell the smoke coming from behind it. You can hear the murmur of voices. You reach out and lift the latch. You are about to enter the sensory overload of the Badstoffa. You are about to meet the fire that keeps you alive and the smoke that is slowly killing you. You lift the wooden latch and push the inner door open. If the outside world was an assault of cold and wind, the inside is an assault of smell and shadow. The moment you cross that threshold, you are hitting a wall of stagnant air. In modern architecture, we obsess over ventilation. We have HVAC systems, exhaust fans, and building codes that mandate air changes per hour. The Vikings had the opposite philosophy. They wanted to trap the air. Every cubic inch of warm air was a precious resource that had been paid for with fuel and body heat. They weren't about to let it escape just because it smelled a little funky. And it does smell. The scent profile of a turf house is complex and overwhelming. It is a mix of wood smoke, drying wool, unwashed human bodies, fermented food, sour milk, and wet dog. It smells like a locker room located inside a chimney. You stop noticing it after about 20 minutes. Nose blindness is a survival mechanism, but that first hit when you come in from the crisp Arctic air is enough to make your eyes water. You step onto the floor. It is hard-packed earth. Over the years, this dirt floor has been stomped down by thousands of footsteps until it has the consistency of low-grade concrete. But it's not dry. Near the door, it's often slick with a mixture of mud tracked in from the porch and the ambient moisture of the house. It has a greasy, organic texture. If you slip here, you aren't just falling on dirt. You are falling on a history of spilled stews and spit. Your eyes struggle to adjust. Coming from the stark white glare of the snow outside, the interior feels like a cave. There are no windows in this hallway. The only light comes from the glow of the hearth further down the tunnel, or perhaps a weak train oil lamp flickering in a niche. The walls are dark turf or rough stone, which sucks up the light rather than reflecting it. You are navigating by touch and memory. This central corridor is called the gangbar in later turf house designs. It's the spine of the house. In the earlier Viking longhouses, everything was one big room. But as the climate got colder in the Middle Ages, a period known as the Little Ice Age, the design evolved. They broke the big hall down into smaller, easier-to-heat rooms, connected by this long, dark tunnel. Walking down the gangbar feels like walking underground. The ceiling is low. If you are tall, you are hunched over. The walls lean in on you. Because the turf is damp, the walls sometimes weep. You can run your hand along the wall and it comes away wet. It feels less like a building and more like a biological structure, like you have been swallowed by a very large, very slow-moving animal. The damp is a permanent roommate. Feel afraid. You cannot escape it. In a modern home, if the walls are wet, you call a contractor because you have a leak. In a turf house, the walls are wet because they are made of wet stuff. The humidity inside is high, often hovering near 100%. This means that nothing ever truly dries. Your clothes are always slightly clammy. Your bedding feels heavy with moisture. You exist in a state of perpetual sogginess. This environment is a paradise for mold. But curiously, The heavy saturation of wood smoke acts as a fungicide. The smoke that irritates your lungs is also the only thing keeping the mold from taking over completely. It's a toxic trade-off. You accept the smoke damage to your respiratory system to prevent the fungal damage to your home. As you move deeper into the house, away from the door, the temperature rises. It's not warm by our standards, maybe 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 15 DC, but compared to the sub-zero blizzard outside, it feels tropical. You start to unlayer. You take off the heavy fur cloak. You hang it on a peg driven into the turf wall. You pass the storage rooms, the pantry, the tool room. These are dark cells branching off the main tunnel. They are cooler, acting as refrigerators for the food. You might hear the rustle of a mouse in the darkness. You ignore it. Mice are just part of the ecosystem. As long as they don't eat the best cheese, they are tolerated. The silence of the construction phase is gone. The house is noisy. You hear the murmur of voices from the main living area, the badstoffa. You hear the coughing. There is always someone coughing in a turf house. The smoke takes its toll. You hear the shifting of cattle if the barn is connected to the house, which it often was to share the heat. This transition zone, this dark, damp corridor, is the psychological airlock that separates the work from the rest. Outside is the struggle, the sheep that needs shearing, the hay that needs cutting, the drift that needs clearing. Inside is the survival. You reach the end of the corridor. The light is brighter here, the heat is palpable on your face. You are approaching the heart of the home, the hearth, the long fire. This is the engine that drives the house, the central utility that cooks the food, dries the clothes, and keeps the frostbite at bay. But it is also a beast that needs to be fed constantly, and which bites back if you aren't careful. You step into the main hall, and the first thing that happens is you start to cry. It isn't an emotional reaction to the beauty of the architecture. It is a biological reaction to the air quality. You have just walked into a room that is essentially a giant slow cooker, and you are the meat. The air is thick and blue, and it hangs in a heavy stratification that hovers about 4 feet off the ground. This is the domain of the long fire, or the Langelder. In the center of the room, there is a long, stone-lined trench running down the middle of the dirt floor. It isn't a fireplace tucked neatly against a wall like we are used to. It is an open pit. Inside this pit, a fire is smoldering. It rarely roars. Roaring fires consume fuel too fast, and fuel is more precious than gold here. Instead, it pulses with a dull orange glow and emits a steady stream of heat and a massive amount of smoke. There is no chimney. The chimney had not been invented yet, or at least it hadn't made it to Iceland. Instead, there is simply a hole in the roof directly above the fire called a tsuri. The idea is that the hot smoke will rise up and float out through the hole into the night sky. It is a simple concept that works perfectly in a physics textbook, but works terribly in a windy turf house. The problem is the updraft. For the smoke to leave, fresh air has to come in to replace it. This creates a draft. But if the wind outside is blowing hard, which it is about 360 days a year, it creates a high-pressure zone over the roof. The wind slams down onto the vent and pushes the smoke back down into the room. It is called back puffing. The room suddenly fills with a blinding, choking cloud that forces everyone to drop to the floor. You quickly learn the geography of the air. The bottom 3 feet of the room are relatively clear. This is the breathable zone. From 3 feet to 5 feet is the haze zone, where you can breathe but you will cough. Above 5 feet is the death zone. It is a solid ceiling of toxic gas. If you stand up straight to stretch your back, you are sticking your head into a chimney flue. This dictates the posture of the Viking Age. You move low. You stoop. You sit down as soon as you enter. The architecture forces you to bow. Let's talk about what they are burning, because this adds a specific flavor to the misery. There are no logs. You aren't throwing a nice piece of oak or maple on the fire. You are burning peat. Peat is essentially baby coal. It is decomposed vegetable matter that has been sitting in a bog for 1,000 years. You have to go out in the summer and cut it into bricks and stack it to dry. When peat burns, it doesn't smell like a campfire. It smells earthy and acrid. It produces a heavy, greasy smoke that sticks to everything. It coats the walls. It coats your clothes. It coats the inside of your lungs. After a winter in a turf house, your lungs look like the filter of a chain smoker's car. But peat is the luxury fuel. If you run out of peat, you burn sheep dung. Yes, you are heating your home with poop. In the summer, you send the kids out to the pastures to collect the dried droppings. You stack them in the barn. When you burn them, they burn hot and fast, but the smell is exactly what you would imagine. It is a barnyard smell that permeates the food you cook and the hair on your head. You cannot wash it off because you don't have a shower. You just become one with the smell. This fire is the only source of light. There are no windows in the main hall. The only natural light comes from the smoke hole in the roof, which is usually covered with a translucent animal stomach frame to keep the rain out, so the room is permanently stuck in a twilight gloom. The corners are pitch black. The shadows dance and stretch as the fire flickers. It creates an atmosphere of constant mystery and mild paranoia. You can see why they believed in elves and trolls. When the lighting is this bad, a pile of wool in the corner looks exactly like a goblin waiting to steal your baby. The fire is also the stove. A large iron cauldron hangs from a chain or a tripod over the embers. This pot never really gets washed. It just gets refilled. It contains a perpetual stew of boiled meat or fish. The smoke from the fire flavors the broth. Everything tastes like smoke. The skyr tastes like smoke. The dried fish tastes like smoke. The water tastes like smoke. You are smoking yourself from the inside out. The health consequences of this are brutal. Archaeologists and historians called it hearth eyes. The constant irritation from the smoke caused chronic conjunctivitis. It was common for people to go blind or partially blind by the time they were old. You traded your sight for warmth. It was a calculated risk. If you didn't have the fire, you froze. If you had the fire, you went blind. Most people chose blindness because you can still tell stories in the dark, but you can't tell stories if you are a frozen corpse. Maintaining the fire is a sacred duty. There are no matches, there are no lighters. If the fire goes out, you are in big trouble. Starting a fire with flint and steel into cold, damp tinder in a dark house is a nightmare, so you never let it go out. At night, you bank the fire. You rake the embers together and cover them with a layer of ash. This limits the oxygen supply, so the coals smolder slowly all night without burning out. In the morning, you rake back the ash and blow on the cherry-red coals to bring them back to life. You feed them fresh peat. The fire is a living thing that has been passed down for generations. The fire in your hearth might technically be the same fire that your grandfather started 50 years ago. It has never been extinguished. It is the continuous soul of the house. Because the fire is the center of everything. The social hierarchy is arranged around it. The master and mistress of the house sit in the middle of the long bench, closest to the warmth. The further away you sit, the lower your status. The slaves and the lowest servants are stuck at the ends of the room, where the drafts are cold and the warmth is just a rumor. You can tell exactly where someone stands in the pecking order by how much they are shivering. The ceiling above the fire is black. It is coated in soot that hangs in stalactites. This soot is actually useful. It is pure carbon. Sometimes they scrape it off to make ink or tattoo pigment, but mostly it just flakes off and falls into your dinner. You get used to the grit in your food. It is just added texture. Living in this smoke creates a unique bond between the inhabitants. You are all sharing the same air. You are all coughing together. The sound of the household is a symphony of wheezing, but there is a coziness to it as well. When the blizzard is screaming outside and the wind is trying to tear the roof off the turf walls hold firm and the fire glows red, you are safe. You are warm. You are slowly being cured like a ham, but you are safe. You move past the fire now. You duck under the smoke line and head toward the back of the hall. You are heading for the badstoffa. This is the living room, the bedroom, and the workshop all rolled into one. This is where the real intimacy of Viking life happens. It is a space so crowded and so communal that the modern concept of privacy simply does not exist. You push past the heavy woolen curtain that separates the hearth hall from the inner sanctum. You are now standing in the badstoffa. If the main hall is the kitchen and the factory, then this room is the bedroom and the living room and the entertainment center all smashed into one. In the later centuries of the turf house tradition, as the climate cooled and timber became even scarcer, the Vikings essentially gave up on heating the big open halls. They retreated into this smaller, more insulated box at the back of the house. It is the architectural equivalent of putting on a sweater and then crawling into a sleeping bag inside a closet. The layout here is totally different from a modern home. There is no furniture in the sense of chairs and tables scattered around. The floor space is just a narrow dirt alleyway running down the middle. The life happens on the sides. Along both long walls, there are raised wooden platforms called the palur. They are built about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. This elevation is critical. The floor is cold and damp and likely has a thin layer of muck on it. By raising the living area, you are lifting yourself out of the squalor. You are climbing up onto a dry island. This platform is everything. It is where you sit during the day to work. It is where you eat your dinner. And at night, it is where you sleep. There are no separate bedrooms. There is just this long wooden shelf. It is basically a communal bunk bed that stretches the entire length of the room. Imagine a college dorm room, but it houses your grandmother and your parents and your siblings and the farm hands and maybe a wandering beggar who needed a place to stay. You are packed in like sardines. The personal space radius is 0. You are constantly touching someone else. An elbow in your ribs or a foot in your lap is just the standard background sensation of life. The sleeping arrangements are intimate by necessity. The beds are essentially wooden boxes filled with dried heather or seaweed and covered with sheepskins. You don't have your own bed. That is a level of luxury that wouldn't even compute. You share a bed, usually 2 people to a bunk, and you don't sleep side by side like a married couple in a sitcom. You sleep head to toe. This is practical. The bed is narrow. If you both had your shoulders at the same end, you wouldn't fit. So you have your head at one end, and your bunkmate has their feet at your face. Hopefully, they wash their feet. But considering the scarcity of hot water, and the fact that they have been walking in manure all day, they probably didn't. You learn to sleep through the smell. You learn to sleep through the snoring, which must have been thunderous in a room with 20 people. There is no privacy. None. If you want to have a private conversation, you have to go outside in the blizzard. If you want to have an argument, the whole house participates. If you want to be romantic, well, that is a logistical challenge that requires extreme stealth and a very heavy blanket. Everyone knows everything about everyone. You know who grinds their teeth, you know who talks in their sleep, you know who has gas after eating skyr. It is a forced intimacy that creates a incredibly tight social bond, but also probably drove people slowly insane. During the day, the women sit on the cross benches at the end of the room, spinning wool or weaving. The men sit on the side benches, carving wood or repairing tools. The children run around in the narrow aisle in the middle or play on the floor. It is a hive of activity. The lighting here is even dimmer than in the main hall. Windows are rare. You might have a tiny square of glass if you are rich, or just a translucent membrane. Most of the light comes from the oil lamps. These are simple stone or iron bowls filled with fish liver oil or seal blubber. A piece of moss serves as the wick. They burn with a sputtering yellow flame, and they smell fishy, so the room is bathed in this greasy yellow twilight. It makes everyone look jaundiced. The shadows are long. You are working by this flicker, trying to thread a needle or carve a rune. It is eye-straining work. Food is served right here on the platform. You don't move to a dining table. The dining table comes to you. Each person has their own personal wooden bowl called an asker. This is a lidded vessel that looks like a small wooden keg. It is your most prized possession. It is your suitcase and your plate. Inside the asker you keep your personal spoon, which is usually made of horn or wood. You might also keep a little butter box. When it is time to eat, the large communal pot is brought in and the food is ladled into your asker. You sit on the edge of the bed with the bowl in your lap and you eat. When you are done, you lick the bowl clean. You don't wash it, you just lick it really well and put the lid back on. It's ready for the next meal. The bacterial colony in that bowl is unique to you. It's your microbiome starter kit. There is a strict hierarchy to where you sit on the palur. The master and mistress of the house sleep in the middle of the room, which is the warmest spot. The servants and farmhands sleep near the door, which is the coldest spot. It is a thermal gradient of status. If you get promoted, you literally move to a warmer bed. But despite the crowding and the smell, there is a coziness here that is hard to replicate in the modern world. This is the origin of the Danish concept of hygge, though the Vikings would probably just call it survival. The wind is screaming outside, battering the turf walls. The temperature out there is 20 below zero, but inside the badstove, it is warm. The body heat of 20 people acts as a furnace. The wool blankets are thick. The stories are being told. A narrator would sit in the corner and recite the sagas. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were the history books and the Netflix of the era. They told of heroes and monsters and legal disputes and family feuds. People would listen while they worked. The rhythm of the spinning wheel and the carving knife would sync up with the rhythm of the poetry. This room is the incubator of Norse culture. It is where the language was preserved. It is where the mythology was passed down. It happened here, in the dark, crowded, overheated air of the Badstoffe. You couldn't leave, so you had to travel with your mind. But wait, it gets warmer. You think having 20 people in a room is cozy. The Vikings had one more trick up their sleeve to generate heat. They didn't just sleep with their family. They slept with the livestock. We are about to go downstairs to meet the heating system, which eats grass and moves. You think having 20 unwashed relatives sleeping in one room is the peak of Viking heating engineering? But you are wrong, because they had a secret weapon. They had a living, breathing, biological furnace that ran on grass and produced approximately 3,000 BTUs of heat per hour. We are talking about the cow. In the modern world, we keep our farm animals in a barn that is far away from the house because we generally agree that sleeping next to a 1,000-pound beast that poops where it stands is not great for hygiene. But the Vikings did not have the luxury of separation. They looked at a cow, and they didn't just see a source of milk and meat. They saw a radiator. A cow has a resting body temperature of about 101 degrees Fahrenheit. That is significantly hotter than a human. It is a massive thermal mass. If you put 6 or 7 cows in a room, they generate an incredible amount of radiant heat. So the Vikings designed their houses to capture this. In many turf houses, especially the smaller ones, the barn or fjöss was built directly underneath the Badstoffe. It was a split-level design. The humans lived upstairs on the wooden platform, and the cows lived downstairs in the basement. Heat rises. It is basic physics. The body heat from the cattle would float up through the floorboards and warm the sleeping quarters above. It was the original underfloor heating system, but instead of warm water pipes running under your floor, you had a massive ruminant animal chewing its cud. If the house wasn't 2 stories, they would build the barn wall to wall with the living room. They might even leave a window or a gap in the partition wall so the heat could flow freely between the animal zone and the human zone. In the poorest houses, there was no partition. You slept on a raised bench, and the cow slept on the dirt floor 3 feet away from you. You could literally reach out and pet your heater in the middle of the night. This symbiotic relationship was critical for survival. During the deep winter, the storms could last for weeks. You couldn't let the cows outside, or they would freeze to death, so they stayed inside for months at a time. They became part of the family. You knew their personalities. You knew which one kicked and which one liked to be scratched behind the ears. But let's talk about the sensory reality of this arrangement, because this is where the romance of the past falls apart completely. Living above a barn means you are living in a cloud of ammonia. Cows produce a lot of waste. A single cow can produce 60 pounds of manure a day. Even if you are diligent about mucking it out, the smell is permanent. The sharp, stinging scent of ammonia would seep up through the floorboards. It mixed with the peat smoke and the unwashed human bodies to create an air profile that would probably knock a modern person unconscious. But to the Vikings, this was just the smell of home. In fact, the ammonia might have had a mild cleaning effect on the air, neutralizing some of the other organic odors, but that is probably just wishful thinking. The noise was another factor. Cows are not silent. They are heavy. They shift their weight, they stomp, they chew. The sound of a cow chewing cud is a wet, rhythmic grinding noise that never stops. Imagine trying to sleep while someone is slowly mixing a bucket of macaroni and cheese right next to your ear. That is the soundtrack of the Viking night. And then there are the other sounds. The digestion of a cow is a violent industrial process. The burps and the gas would resonate through the small house. You would wake up in the pitch black wondering if a troll was growling under your bed. But no, it was just Bessie processing yesterday's hay. But you tolerated it. You tolerated the smell and the noise and the flies because the alternative was freezing. When the fire died down in the middle of the night, the cows kept working. They were the backup generator that never turned off. This closeness also meant that the animals were incredibly tame. These weren't range cattle that ran wild. These were animals that were hand-reared and lived inside the house. They were likely treated with more affection than some of the children. A good cow was worth a fortune. It was a renewable resource. If your child died, it was a tragedy, but if your cow died, it was an economic catastrophe that could wipe out the whole family. So you kept them close, you kept them warm. You protected your investment. The sheep were often kept in a separate building because their wool keeps them warmer and they smell even worse when wet. But the sick lambs or the weak calves would be brought right into the badstofa. It was common to wake up with a baby goat sleeping on your feet. It was a multi-species pile-on. This arrangement also helped the fuel crisis. By relying on animal heat, you didn't have to burn as much peat. You could bank the fire earlier in the evening. You were essentially trading air quality for fuel efficiency. It was a calculation they made every single day. There is something strangely intimate about this survival strategy. It blurs the line between human and animal. In the dark of winter, when the sun doesn't rise for weeks, you're all just warm mammalian bodies huddling together against the void. You breathe the same air. You share the same warmth. You are part of the same biological machine. But this machine required maintenance. The daily grind of keeping this household running was relentless. You couldn't just sit around and enjoy the cow heat. You had to work. The darkness of the house didn't mean you got to sleep all day. It meant you had to work in the dark. We are about to look at the daily routine inside this sensory deprivation tank and how they managed to be productive in a room where you could barely see your own hands. You wake up and it is dark. You eat breakfast and it is dark. You work all day and it is dark. You go to sleep and it is dark. This is the reality of the Icelandic winter. The sun is a theoretical concept. It might make a brief cameo appearance on the horizon for 3 or 4 hours around noon, but it is weak and watery and provides almost no useful illumination. So life inside the turf house is lived in a permanent state of twilight. You are essentially living in a submarine that is running on emergency power. The artificial lighting technology is primitive even by medieval standards. They didn't have nice beeswax candles. Those were for churches and rich people in Europe. Here they have the cola. This is a small bowl made of stone or brass. You fill it with lysai. That is the polite word for fish liver oil or seal blubber that has been rendered down into a thick sludge. You take a piece of cotton grass which grows in the bogs and you twist it into a wick. You float it in the oil and light it. It doesn't burn with a clean white flame. It burns with a sputtering yellow tongue of fire that puts out about as much light as a dying flashlight. And the smell. If you thought the burning poop was bad, wait until you smell the burning rancid fish oil. It has a heavy, cloying scent that coats the back of your throat. The soot from these lamps is greasy. It drifts up and sticks to the ceiling. It sticks to your face. By the end of the day, everyone looks like they are wearing poorly applied coal miner makeup. You blow your nose and the handkerchief comes away black. This is the indoor pollution that archaeologists talk about. The particulate matter in the air inside a turf house was higher than downtown Beijing on a bad smog day. You are breathing in carbon and vaporized fat 24 hours a day. But despite the darkness and the toxic air, you cannot just sit there. The Viking Age was not a time for leisure. If you weren't working, you were starving. So the house becomes a factory. The women are the engines of the economy. They are spinning wool. In the early Viking Age, they didn't even have spinning wheels. They used a drop spindle. It is a weighted stick that you spin with your fingers to twist the raw wool into yarn. It is slow. It is incredibly tedious. You have to do it constantly. A woman would spin while she was walking. She would spin while she was nursing a baby. She would spin while she was dying of plague. They are making vadmal. This is a coarse woolen cloth that was the Gore-Tex of the Middle Ages, but it was also money. In Iceland, you could pay your taxes in cloth. You could buy a farm with cloth. The legal standard for currency was literally measured in yards of woven wool. So the women in the Badstofa aren't just making clothes. They are printing money. The click-clack of the loom and the whir of the spindle is the sound of the mint working overtime. The men are busy too. They are sitting on the edge of the bed carving. They are making everything they need because there is no Walmart. They are carving spoons out of horn. They are carving bowls out of driftwood. They are repairing the leather harnesses for the horses. This work requires light, so you have to huddle around the few cola lamps. You form little clusters of industry, 3 or 4 people leaning in toward a single flickering flame, trying to see what they are doing. It strains the eyes. It destroys your posture. You are permanently hunched. This period of the evening is called the Kvöldvaka. It translates to the evening wake. It is the time between dusk and bedtime when the real work happens. It is a sacred time. It is quiet except for the work sounds, the scratching of a knife on wood, the rhythmic thumping of the loom. But there is also entertainment. While everyone is working with their hands, their minds are free. This is when the storytelling happens. One person, usually the head of the household or a designated storyteller, recites the sagas. They tell the stories of Egil Skallagrimsson and his violent poetry. They tell the story of Njal and his burning house. These aren't just stories. They are lessons. They teach you the law. They teach you genealogy. Remember that guy who killed his neighbor over a sheep? Well, his great-grandson is your cousin, so don't marry him. It is a way of maintaining the social fabric in a society that doesn't have written records for the common people. The acoustics of the turf house are perfect for this. The turf walls absorb the echo. The voice is warm and close. It creates a hypnotic atmosphere. You are sitting in the semi-dark, smelling the smoke and the fish oil, listening to a voice describe a sword fight that happened 200 years ago, while your hands automatically twist the wool. It is a trance state, but the air quality issues catch up with you. The combination of the peat smoke from the hearth and the oil smoke from the lamps creates a chemical cocktail that irritates the lungs. Chronic bronchitis and emphysema were standard features of adult life. You would hear the wheezing. The old people in the corner would have a smoker's cough, even though tobacco hadn't been discovered yet. They were smoking their house. The carbon monoxide levels must have been borderline dangerous at times. If the wind blew the wrong way and the smoke didn't vent, you would all get headaches and feel drowsy. You might think it was just the coziness making you sleepy, but actually you were being slowly poisoned. It was a delicate balance between freezing to death and gassing yourself. Cleanliness is a relative concept here. You don't take baths. Heating enough water to fill a tub requires a massive amount of fuel, which you don't have. So you spot clean. You wash your face and hands in a basin of cold water. Maybe once a week you do a more thorough scrub. But generally you just accept that you and everyone else smells like a smoked ham wrapped in wet wool. The floor is the other problem. It is dirt. You try to keep it swept, but it is impossible to keep clean. Scraps of wool and wood shavings fall onto it. Food falls onto it. It gets trampled in. The floor slowly rises over the years as layers of compressed debris build up. Archaeologists love this. They can dig through the floor of a turf house and read the history of the family like tree rings. Here is the layer where they ate a lot of fish. Here is the layer where they did a lot of wood carving. You are walking on your own garbage. But amidst the grime and the gloom, there is a tremendous amount of productivity. The turf house is not a place of stagnation. It is a hive. They produced intricate tapestries. They carved beautiful erratic patterns into their wood. They wrote poetry that is still studied in universities today. They did it all in a room that was darker than a nightclub and smelled like a barn. You finish your work for the night, you blow out the lamp to save the oil. The darkness becomes absolute. The only light is the red glow of the banked fire in the distance. You crawl under your sheepskin blanket. Your stomach rumbles. You realize you haven't eaten since the midday meal. It is time to raid the pantry. But the pantry in a turf house is not a cupboard full of Doritos. It is a biology experiment in fermentation and preservation. You crawl out of your warm bunk and head towards the pantry. In a modern house, you open the fridge and are bathed in a soft electric light while you decide between leftover pizza or a yogurt. In a turf house, you are walking into a pitch-black room that smells like a chemistry lab, where something has gone wrong. You have to understand that the Vikings had a major problem. They had a lot of food in the summer and absolutely zero food in the winter, and they didn't have the two things that make food preservation easy. They didn't have freezers, and they didn't have salt. Well, they had the ocean, which is full of salt, but to get the salt out of the water, you have to boil it. Boiling requires fire. Fire requires wood, and, as we established, they didn't have any wood. So, making salt was incredibly expensive. You couldn't just waste it on curing a ham. So, they had to get creative. They had to turn to the power of bacteria. The pantry is the boor. It is a cold room, usually dug a bit deeper into the ground to take advantage of the geothermal cooling. It stays at a steady refrigerator temperature year-round. But cooling isn't enough to stop the rot. You need to change the chemical composition of the food. The hero of the Viking pantry is whey. They called it misa. When you make skyr, which is the Icelandic super yogurt, you separate the curds from the liquid. The curds are the skyr that you eat. The liquid is the misa. Most people would throw this away. The Vikings hoarded it like it was holy water. Old misa goes sour. It becomes acidic. It essentially turns into vinegar. Since they couldn't afford salt, they pickled everything in this sour milk waste. You walk into the pantry and you see huge wooden barrels. You lift the lid. Inside, floating in a pool of purple-grey liquid, are sheep heads, or sausages, or ram's testicles. They are bobbing there in the sour whey. This preservation method kept the food edible for months or even years, but it changed the flavor profile. Everything tasted sour. The meat was sour. The sausages were sour. The fat was sour. You weren't eating fresh food. You were eating food that had been chemically burned by lactic acid. It was a diet designed to destroy your enamel. Then there is the skyr itself. This wasn't the nice fruity cup you buy at the supermarket. This was gamal skyr, old skyr. They would pack it into massive barrels and just let it sit there. It would ferment further. It would get thicker and more pungent. A crust of mold would form on top. You would just scrape that off and eat the cheese-like substance underneath. It was incredibly nutritious, but it was heavy. A bowl of that stuff sits in your stomach like a cannonball. But the real horror show of the pantry is the shark. This is the famous Huckharl. The Greenland shark is a massive, prehistoric-looking beast that swims in the deep, freezing waters. The problem is that its meat is toxic. It has high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide. Basically, the shark doesn't pee, so its flesh is full of urine. If you eat it fresh, you die. A normal person would say, well, I guess we won't eat the poisonous pea shark. The Vikings said, no, let's figure this out. They discovered that if you bury the shark in a hole in the ground and press the fluids out of it with stones for a few months and then hang it up to dry for another few months, the poison breaks down. The result is a rubbery cube of meat that smells exactly like strong ammonia cleaning fluid. It smells like a dirty public restroom. But it is pure calories. In the dead of winter, when the sheep were skinny and the stores were running low, a chunk of rotten shark was the difference between life and death. You didn't eat it for the flavor. You ate it because it was fuel. You chased it with a shot of Brennivin, or burnt wine, which is a caraway-flavored schnapps, essentially designed to burn the taste buds off your tongue so you don't have to taste the shark. Look up at the rafters of the pantry. It looks like a bat cave. Hanging from the beams are hangiklot, hung meats. These are legs of lamb that have been smoked. But remember, they are smoking them with dried sheep dung. So the meat has a very distinct sharp flavor. It is delicious in a rustic, survivalist kind of way. The smoke dries the meat out until it is hard as wood. You have to slice it paper thin to eat it. Then there is the fish. Hardfisker. Hardfish. This is cod or haddock that has been gutted and hung outside in the wind until it is completely dehydrated. It looks like a piece of bark. It feels like a piece of bark. To eat it, you have to take a hammer or a rock and smash it on a stone anvil to break the fibers. Then you slather it in butter to make it swallowable. It is basically fish jerky, but without the teriyaki sauce. It is pure protein. You can keep a piece of hard fish in your pocket for 5 years and it will still be edible. It is the ultimate MRE. The smell of the pantry is a physical wall. It is sour, fishy, smoky, and ammonia heavy. It is the smell of biological warfare against decay. But to a Viking, this smell triggered a Pavlovian response. It meant security. A full pantry meant you weren't going to starve. You grab a handful of dried fish and maybe a ladle of sour skyr. You try not to breathe through your nose while you serve it. You are eating bacteria cultures and fermented enzymes. Your gut biome must have been made of titanium. Modern probiotics have nothing on a Viking breakfast. There is one more thing in the pantry. A barrel of syrah. This is the beverage. It is water mixed with the sour whey. It is a refreshing acidic drink that they drank instead of water. Why? because water goes bad. It grows algae, but the acidic way kills the bugs. It was the energy drink of the Middle Ages. It gave you electrolytes and hydration, and it made your lips pucker. You take your sour food back to the dark back sofa. You sit on your bed next to your sleeping cousin and the chewing cow. You gnaw on the dried fish. The wind howls outside. You are safe. You are fed. But all this eating and drinking leads to the inevitable biological consequence. The input must become output. And in a house where you are snowed in for weeks at a time and there is no plumbing, the question of where you go to the bathroom is not a trivial one. It is a logistical nightmare that involves recycling in ways that will make you very uncomfortable. The uncomfortable reality of history is that everyone poops. But in a Viking turf house during a blizzard, this biological necessity becomes a logistical nightmare. We tend to gloss over this part when we watch movies about tough warriors. We imagine them brooding on a cliff edge. We rarely imagine them squatting over a frozen hole in the ground while gale-force winds try to frostbite their most sensitive areas. So let's talk about the toilet, or the salerni as they called it. In a large, wealthy chieftain's house, the toilet might be a small room attached to the main building. It would be located near the door to keep the smell away from the living quarters, but close enough that you didn't have to walk a mile in the snow. It was a communal latrine, a long wooden bench with holes cut in it. You sat side by side with your family and friends. It was a social activity. You could discuss the weather or the sheep while you did your business. But in a smaller, poorer turf house, the facilities were much more basic. Often it was just a small shed outside. In the middle of winter, making a trip to the outhouse was a life-threatening expedition. You had to put on your boots and your cloak. You had to open the door and let the heat out. You had to fight your way through the snowdrift. If the wind was blowing hard enough, it could literally blow you off your feet. Many people just didn't bother. This brings us to the night bucket. This is exactly what it sounds like. A wooden bucket kept in the corner of the badstofa. Remember, that room is packed with 20 people sleeping head to toe. If you had to go in the middle of the night, you used the bucket right there, next to your sleeping grandmother. The sound and the smell were shared with everyone. It killed any sense of modesty. You just learned to look away. You learned to hold your breath. But here is where the story takes a turn into the truly gross. To us, urine is waste. It is something to be flushed away instantly. To a Viking, urine was a chemical asset. It was a cleaning product. It was money in liquid form. Urine contains urea. When urea breaks down, it turns into ammonia. Ammonia is a powerful base. It cuts through grease. It bleaches things. It kills germs. In a world without soap factories or bottles of bleach, ammonia was the only industrial strength cleaner they had. So, they didn't throw the urine away. They saved it. Every morning, the night bucket was carefully emptied, not into the drain, but into a large barrel called the hand barrel. This barrel stood in the entryway or sometimes right in the pantry. They let it sit there. They let it ferment. The older the urine, the stronger the ammonia, and the better it cleaned. Imagine the smell. You have the peat smoke, you have the burning fish oil, you have the cow manure from the basement, and now you have a 50-gallon drum of stale fermenting urine sitting by the front door. The air in a turf house wasn't just stuffy. It was chemically aggressive. They used this hand for everything. They used it to wash their clothes, specifically the wool. Wool straight off the sheep is full of lanolin, which is a greasy wax. You can't weave it until you get the grease out. Water won't touch it. You need a degreaser. So they would stomp the wool in a tub of stale urine. It dissolved the grease perfectly. They also used it for personal hygiene. And this is the part that ruins the romantic image of the clean Viking. We know from archaeology that Vikings were actually very well groomed compared to other medieval Europeans. We find combs and ear spoons and tweezers in their graves. English monks used to complain that the Vikings stole all the English women because the Vikings combed their hair and took baths on Saturdays. But what did they wash with? They often used the urine. They would wash their faces and their hair in it. The ammonia acted as a bleach. It kept their hair bright and blonde. It killed the lice. It cleaned the skin. It sounds horrific to us. You are washing your face with pee. But to them, it was just the local version of a chemical peel. They would rinse with water afterwards if they had it, but the faint metallic tang of ammonia would linger. So, when you picture a beautiful Viking shield maiden with flowing blonde hair, just remember that she probably achieved that shade of blonde by soaking her head in a bucket of her family's waste. Let's talk about the bath. The word badstoffa actually means bathroom. In the early days of the settlement, they used to have steam baths inside the houses. They would heat rocks in the fire and pour water on them like a sauna. It was a ritual of cleanliness. But as the timber ran out and the fuel became scarce, they couldn't afford to heat rocks just for sweating. The sauna culture died out. The badstoffa became just a living room. The bath, part of the name, became a lie. In the later centuries, bathing became a rare luxury. You might wash your hands and face daily, but a full body wash happened maybe a few times a year. If you were lucky enough to live near a hot spring, you could bathe more often. Iceland is full of geothermal pools. The Snornol is a famous stone-lined pool built by the historian Snorre Sturluson in the 13th century. He had plumbing that brought boiling water straight from a vent into his hot tub. He was living the dream, but for the average farmer stuck in a snowdrift, there was no hot tub. There was just the cold wash basin and the lice. Oh, the lice, they were everywhere. Every single human being hosted a colony of head lice and body lice. We find the combs in the archaeological digs, and they are double-sided with very fine teeth. These weren't for styling, these were for scraping the parasites off your scalp. It was a daily social activity. You would sit on the bench and pick the lice off your child's head. You would crack them between your thumbnails. It was a bonding moment. I love you, so I will remove the bugs from your hair. The bedding was infested too. The sheepskins they slept under were warm, but they were also a zoo for fleas. Periodically, they would have to take all the bedding outside and freeze it. They would leave it in the snow for a day, hoping the cold would kill the bugs. It helped a little, but the bugs always came back. The itching was constant. If you look at the skeletons from this period, you sometimes see scratches on the bones from infections caused by constant itching. The floor was another hygiene hazard. We talked about the dirt floor rising. In some excavations, they found layers of Hallenstein, or urine stone. This is a mineral deposit that forms when urine reacts with the ash and dirt on the floor. The floor was literally calcifying from the amount of waste that was spilled on it. You were walking on a geological formation made of pee. This is the cynical realism of the turf house. It was an engineering marvel. It kept people alive in a climate that should have killed them. But the cost was a complete surrender of what we consider basic sanitation. They lived in a soup of organic compounds. They recycled everything because they couldn't afford to waste anything. The smell would fade into the background. The itching would just become a habit. You would stop noticing the taste of the ammonia in the air. You would just focus on the warmth. But turf houses do not last forever. They are made of organic materials. They are made of dirt and grass and wood, and nature always takes back what is hers. The rot is always waiting. Eventually the house begins to die, and when a turf house dies, it doesn't just fall down and it dissolves. The thing about building a house out of dirt and grass is that it eventually wants to go back to being dirt and grass. A turf house is not a pyramid. It is not built for eternity. It is a temporary truce with nature. It is a biological organism that has a lifespan, just like the people living inside it. If you stop maintaining a stone castle, it might lose its roof, but the walls will stand for 500 years. If you stop maintaining a turf house, it dissolves, it melts, it sinks back into the landscape like a sugar cube in hot tea. The average lifespan of a turf house is only about 20 to 70 years, depending on how well you treat it. That means you are constantly rebuilding your own home. Every generation has to tear down the rotting walls and stack fresh turf. It is a cycle of renewal. You live in your grandfather's house, but you are living in your own dirt. The end of a turf house is a slow, melancholy process. It starts with the smell. The earthy smell turns musty. The dampness gets aggressive. The frost heaves the ground and the walls start to bulge outward. The batter, or the inward slope that held the wall up, starts to fail. The wall gets a beer belly. It leans. Then the roof beams give way. The driftwood that traveled all the way from Siberia finally gets tired. The rot eats into the ends where they sit on the damp stones. One night during a storm, you hear a crack. The roof sags. It looks like a tired animal lying down. When a house was abandoned, the Vikings didn't call a demolition crew. They just walked away. They took the valuable wood, the door frame, the pillars, the paneling, and they left the shell. Within a few years, the grass on the roof grows wild. It merges with the grass on the walls. The structure loses its sharp geometric lines. It becomes a green mound. Travel around Iceland today, and you will see these mounds everywhere. They look like lumpy hills, but if you look closely, you can see the faint outline of a room. You can see where the door used to be. You are looking at the ghost of a home. 1,000 years of history is hidden inside those bumps in the ground. In the early 20th century, the modern world finally came to the North Atlantic. Concrete arrived. Corrugated iron arrived. The Icelanders were desperate to leave their mud huts. They wanted to be modern. They wanted clean white walls and square corners. They wanted to escape the smoke and the damp and the smell of the cow in the basement. So they bulldozed the turf houses, or just let them rot, and they moved into concrete houses. And then a funny thing happened. They started freezing. Concrete is a terrible insulator. It is cold, and it bridges the temperature from the outside right to the inside. The turf houses had been damp, but they were warm. The new concrete houses were damp and cold. Tuberculosis rates spiked. People were shivering in their modern kitchens, missing the suffocating warmth of the dirt walls. It took decades for modern heating technology to catch up to the efficiency of the turf house. We had to invent fiberglass insulation and central heating and double-paned glass just to achieve what a Viking did with a shovel and a pile of mud. There is a deep irony there. We spent a century mocking these primitive dwellings, only to realize that they were the ultimate eco-friendly housing. They were sustainable. They had a zero carbon footprint. They were biodegradable. They were heated by body mass. Today, architects are winning awards for designing green roofs and earth-sheltered homes. They are just reinventing the wheel that the Norsemen perfected 1,000 years ago. But the era of the turf house is gone. The fires have gone out, the smoke has cleared, the cows have been moved to proper barns with ventilation, the darkness has been chased away by electric lights. Yet there is something haunting about the idea of them. Imagine that silence. The thick walls dampening the sound of the world, the absolute darkness of the winter night, the feeling of being buried safely in the earth. The storm is finally dying down outside. The wind has stopped screaming. It is just a soft whistle now. The snow is falling straight down. It covers the roof of the turf house in a thick white blanket. Inside, the fire is banked low. It is just a bed of glowing red coals under the grey ash. The heat is gentle. The breathing of the household slows down. The cattle in the basement are asleep. The sheep are asleep. The people are asleep. The house itself seems to sleep. It settles into the ground. It holds its breath. You are warm. You are heavy. The smell of the smoke is no longer sharp. It is just a memory of warmth. The darkness is not scary. It is a velvet curtain that wraps around you. You are part of the earth. You are safe in the ground. The winter cannot touch you here. The snow keeps falling, covering the tracks, covering the roof, covering the world. Everything is white. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. The end. Sweet dreams.